The bedroom door in my parents' house never had a lock. I know that because for years I used to lie awake calculating exactly how many footsteps it took to cross the hallway, just in case I ever needed to know. I was 16 the first time I understood that the absence of a lock wasn't an oversight. It was a design choice. A girl in our community was never meant to need privacy from her own family, because privacy implied she had something to keep separate from them, and nothing about her was supposed to be separate from anything. My name is Rebecca. I grew up in a closed religious community in upstate New York, the kind most outsiders only hear about through documentaries that never quite get it right. I left 4 years ago, and this channel is where I say the things I was taught would cost me my soul to say out loud. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe and hit the like button, and tell me in the comments whether you grew up somewhere your own thoughts were treated as something to be managed rather than something that belonged to you. I read every comment. Let me tell you about control. Not the kind that announces itself with raised voices or closed fists, though I know that kind exists too, and I don't mean to diminish it. I'm talking about the quieter kind, the kind that doesn't leave marks, the kind that works by convincing you the cage was your idea in the first place. In the world outside, autonomy is treated as a baseline assumption. You make your own choices about your education, your money, your friendships, your body, and people only intervene when something goes seriously wrong. In my community, autonomy wasn't a baseline. It was a privilege granted in small, revocable portions, and every portion came with an invisible string attached to someone else's approval. I was the third of 6 children, raised by a father who believed, with complete sincerity, that he was protecting us from a world designed to destroy our souls, and a mother who had internalized her own restrictions so thoroughly that she no longer experienced them as restrictions at all. She would have told you, if you'd asked, that she was the freest woman she knew. I believed that too, for a long time, because believing anything else meant believing my entire childhood had been built on something false. I want to be careful here, because I've spent years in therapy learning the difference between what happened and the story I told myself about what happened, and the difference matters more to me now than almost anything else. My father never hit me. My mother never screamed. Nobody in my family ever did anything that, described in isolation, would sound dramatic enough to justify the years it took me to leave. What happened instead was smaller and more constant, 1,000 tiny redirections of who I was allowed to become, repeated so often and so calmly that questioning any single one of them felt unreasonable, even to me. The community didn't run on a single set of written rules, not really. There was a rule book, technically, pages of guidance about modesty and obedience and the proper order of a household, but the real machinery operated somewhere underneath the written word, in the things everyone simply understood without being told. You learned them the way you learn a language as a child, by absorption, by watching the faces of the adults around you when someone stepped slightly outside the lines. I was 14 when I first felt the particular kind of dread that comes from wanting something you've already been taught to be ashamed of wanting. There was a public library 2 towns over, and a girl I knew had been there once on an approved errand and come back describing rows of books on subjects nobody at home would ever discuss. I wanted to go. I wanted it with an intensity that frightened me. The way you want something your whole body insists is dangerous and necessary at the same time. I didn't ask my parents directly. I'd learned by then that direct questions about anything outside the community's narrow channel of approved activity were treated less like requests and more like symptoms, evidence that something needed correcting in me before it became a real problem. Instead, I asked obliquely, mentioning the library the way you might mention a small ache, testing whether anyone would react. My mother's response wasn't anger, it was concern, soft and immediate, the kind of concern that somehow felt heavier than anger would have. She asked why I wanted to go. She asked what I thought I'd find there that I couldn't find at home. She told me gently that curiosity wasn't wrong in itself, but that an unguided mind was like an unguided field, that anything could take root in it if you weren't careful about what you let in. Then she changed the subject to something about dinner, and the conversation was over, and somehow I understood that I would not be going to the library, and that asking again would only confirm whatever quiet worry I'd already planted in her. That was the pattern, again and again for years. Nothing was ever forbidden outright. Instead, everything outside the approved boundaries was reframed as evidence of a deeper spiritual problem, something to be gently corrected rather than a legitimate desire to be taken seriously. By the time I was 16, I had become extraordinarily skilled at not wanting things. Or rather, at not noticing that I wanted them, because noticing only led to that particular flavor of soft, suffocating concern. And I had learned that avoiding the concern was easier than confronting what caused it. There's a friend I'll call Naomi, who I grew up alongside from early childhood. She was a year older than me, married at 19 to a man chosen with significant input from both families, and by the time I was 18 she already had one child, and was visibly pregnant with a second. I remember sitting with her on her porch one summer afternoon, shelling peas, when she said something that has stayed lodged in my chest for years afterward. I'd asked her, carefully, whether she'd ever wanted something different. Not in those exact words, because we didn't have a shared vocabulary for that kind of question. I asked something closer to whether she ever thought about the life she might have had if things had gone differently. She was quiet for a long moment, her hands still moving through the pea pods without pause. And then she said that wanting was the kind of thing you learned to set down, the way you set down a heavy basket once you realized you'd be carrying it a long way. I didn't understand the full weight of that sentence then. I understand it completely now. She wasn't telling me she was happy. She was telling me she had found a way to survive, by no longer registering the difference between happiness and its absence, and that this, in her experience, was simply what growing up meant. There's a portion of this story I'm not able to tell in full on this platform, not because the details are too graphic, but because some of what happened inside that community, particularly around how dissent was actually handled once it became impossible to ignore, involves people who are still inside, still vulnerable, and I've had to make careful choices about what I can say here without putting anyone at risk. I've written the fuller account elsewhere, without those constraints. If you want the complete story, the link is in the first comment. The real turning point for me came when I was 19, and it had nothing to do with a single dramatic event. It had to do with my younger sister, Sarah, who was 12 at the time, and who had begun asking the exact kinds of questions I had trained myself out of asking years earlier. She wanted to know why the boys in our family were allowed to finish a full course of schooling while the girls stopped earlier. She wanted to know why our father reviewed every letter she received before she was allowed to read it herself. She asked these questions out loud, at the dinner table, with the kind of fearless persistence that 12-year-olds sometimes have before the world teaches them otherwise. I watched my parents respond to her exactly the way they had once responded to me. The gentle redirection, the soft concern, the implication that her questions were symptoms of something gone wrong inside her, rather than legitimate observations about the world. And for the first time in years I saw the pattern from the outside instead of from inside it. I saw with a clarity that frightened me that I had been living inside a system specifically engineered to make its own restrictions invisible to the people restricted by them, and that the system was about to do the exact same thing to my sister that it had already done to me. That recognition didn't make me leave immediately. I want to be honest about that, because I think people who haven't lived inside a closed community sometimes imagine that clarity and departure happen together, in the same moment, and that isn't how it works. Clarity came first, and it sat inside me for almost 2 years, a slow-burning, unbearable awareness that I couldn't unsee, while I continued going to church meetings and helping with canning and attending the same gatherings I'd attended my entire life, all while quietly building, piece by piece, the practical foundation that would eventually let me leave. There was a woman in our community I'll call Esther, in her 60s by the time I knew her well, who had lived her entire life inside the faith, but who had a way of saying things sideways that I've come to understand, looking back, was its own form of quiet resistance. She had no power to change the rules, but she had decades of practice finding the small spaces inside the rules where something like agency could still exist. One afternoon, while we were canning tomatoes together, she mentioned, without any particular emphasis, that her oldest daughter had moved to Albany for nursing school 15 years earlier, and that nobody in the family spoke about it, but that Esther herself wrote to her twice a year, addressed to a post office box, and that nobody needed to know the details of what was inside those letters. She didn't frame it as advice, she didn't even look at me directly while she said it, but she handed me the next jar to seal, and I understood that she had just told me something important, not about her daughter, but about the existence of a door, somewhere, that I hadn't known was there. I started saving money when I was 19, in amounts too small to be noticed, from the small allowance my father gave me for the goods I sold at the community market. I started, very slowly, asking the kinds of questions that wouldn't trigger the soft concern, Questions about transportation routes, about which towns had bus stations, about what kind of identification a person needed to open a bank account in the outside world. I asked these questions the way you ask about the weather, casually, spaced out over months, never enough at once to seem like a pattern. By the time I was 21, I had a bag packed and hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the barn, containing identification documents I'd quietly requested through channels I won't describe here, a small amount of cash, and a single phone number belonging to a woman who ran a support network for people leaving closed religious communities. A number Esther had given me 8 months earlier without either of us ever directly acknowledging what it was for. I left on a Tuesday morning in early spring, while my family believed I was at the market. I didn't say goodbye to anyone, because I understood that a goodbye would have given someone the chance to stop me. And I had watched enough departures from a distance over the years to know exactly how quickly a community could mobilize around the threat of losing one of its own. The shunning, when it came, was immediate and total. My mother's letters stopped within the first month. My father has not spoken to me since the day I left, 4 years ago now. I found my own apartment in Syracuse, enrolled in community college at 22, and started seeing a therapist named Dr. Patel, a woman with a quiet, patient way of asking questions that never once made me feel like a problem to be corrected. In one of our early sessions, I described my childhood in the only language I had at the time, language that minimized almost everything, because minimizing was the only mode I had ever been taught. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said something I have carried with me every day since. She said that the absence of a name for something doesn't mean the thing doesn't exist. It just means nobody has given you permission to call it by its real name yet. What I understand now, 4 years removed from that life, is that my father was not a villain in the way villains exist in stories. He was a man who had been raised inside a system so thoroughly that he could not see its walls, who genuinely believed he was protecting his children rather than confining them, and who would have been sincerely bewildered to hear his daughter describe her childhood the way I am describing it now. That doesn't excuse what happened. It explains how something so quietly damaging managed to look, from the inside, like nothing more than an ordinary, faithful life. Esther gave me a phone number. My mother gave me concern dressed up as love. The community gave me silence dressed up as structure. And somewhere in all of that, slowly, painfully, I found my way to a version of myself that nobody had pre-approved. My sister Sarah is 16 now. We're in contact, carefully, through channels that protect her while she finishes the years she has left inside that house. She asks me questions constantly, the same kind of questions she was asking at 12, except now there's someone on the other end of the line who answers them honestly instead of redirecting them into something smaller and safer. Every time she asks, I answer, even when I don't have a complete answer. Especially then. If you grew up somewhere your own curiosity was treated as a problem to be managed, I see you. If you were told that wanting things was a flaw in your character rather than a normal part of being human, I see you too. If you found your own version of a hidden floorboard, your own quiet Esther, your own small act of resistance disguised as something practical and unremarkable, I see that too, and I want you to know it counted, even if nobody around you ever called it by its real name. You were not foolish for staying as long as you did. You were working with the only tools you'd been given, inside a system specifically built to keep you from ever realizing better tools existed. That was never your fault. If you want to read more of this story, the parts I can't fully unpack within these limits, the link is in the first comment. And that's everything for today. Choose the doors you didn't know were there. Sometimes they're the ones that save you.